If you're only 20 years old, think back and imagine that none of the world today had existed yet. And then stop for a moment and think, what was the world like then in the summer of 2001? And then you get up today and you look out to the world and you try to make sense of it without any knowledge of the last 20 years of history. You would be, I suspect, befuddled, confused, mystified. You would have a deep, deep desire, a drive even, to try to assess how is it that the world became what the world is today. It's absolutely astounding to contemplate, just a mere 20 years of difference. If you went to the airport to get here, your whole experience would be different. Anywhere you walk around today, what you would notice, governments locking people in their homes for their own good, right? How in the world did we get here today? How is it that a health scare, a pandemic, so radically transformed the situation of everyday life? In order to answer those questions, you would need to engage in the process that historians engage in all the time. You would need to be able to ask yourself, first, what happened? What is different today, 20 years from that moment that you remember, to today? So you would need to assess and articulate for yourself a record of events. Let's see, how would you do that? You'd have to ask yourself some questions. How do I know what happened? Maybe you'll just ask your friends. You'll ask those in your life. Tell me about the last 20 years. You get a lot of different stories. You get a lot of different accounts of what caused what. So you think to yourself, I know, there are news channels, there are journalists. Let me go back and just read the record of the news over the last 20 years. That will help me understand how we came to this point in history. No? Well, better yet, let me go and access some government records. How will I know whether they're true? How will I know what to discern as being not useful in my assessment of what came this 20 years, what brought this change, and what is useful? In a sense, I think that one of the best observations about our world today, from someone who did live through the last 20 years and who has lived through the last year, is that we are, in a sense, in a moment of an epistemological crisis. We are in a moment when, in the public, today, simply asking someone to account for the change in our culture, in our politics, in our society over the last 20 years is a very difficult thing to do, because people don't know how to assess what counts as evidence and what does not, how to read documents produced by real people and assess who are these people, what's their angle, do they have a bias? Do I understand this as an unspoken kind of truth because of who they are? Or is there some kind of process I need to go through in order to understand what this document or this person really means? These are the tools and the skills of historians. Now, just again, and I did this out of, the arbitrariness of 20 years works out quite nicely because, of course, the summer of 2001 was before 9/11. So much, of course, changed in September of 2001. But just so, for those of you who don't have as good a historical memory for 20 years ago, the first iPod wouldn't be introduced until October of that year. Not iPhone, iPod, right? The way to revolutionize music in the entertainment industry. One of the biggest political stories of that summer, there was some congressman from California whose intern went missing. Everybody remember Chandra Levy? Yeah, right? Representative Condit from California. The first billionaire actually spent 7 days in space. Maybe that's a little bit familiar. Wait a minute. I thought they just did that. No, actually Dennis Tito went up in a Soyuz rocket and spent 7 days on Mir. This is actually, again, a failure of historical memory. Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos are arguing about whether they got high enough. 66 miles, 60 miles. Are they actually past the threshold of space? I mean, this guy paid as a tourist. He paid the Russians, which is a big risk, as you might imagine. It was enough of a risk that NASA actually failed or refused to train him when he came for his American side training on the ISS. They said that the 2 cosmonauts and Dennis Tito had to leave because they weren't going to train him. They thought it was too much of a risk. Well, he got to space, he got to Mir, he spent 7 days there. And he paid for the commercial purpose. So, first billionaire in space. Fights over the 10 Commandments in an Alabama courthouse. People maybe remember that. Judge Moore. The Netherlands adopted the world's first same-sex marriage law. Just imagine the world. I mean, of course, the information that I drew said the first time since Nero, which was kind of like okay. It's an interesting comparison, but just imagine how much the world has changed. And then one last thing, just to, I think this might blow your socks off. That summer, a senator in the United States Congress said the following in regard to our history education. Our failure to insist that the words and actions of our forefathers be handed down from generation to generation will ultimately mean a failure to perpetuate this wonderful, glorious experiment in representative democracy. Without the lessons learned from the past, how can we ensure that our nation's core ideals, life, liberty, and justice, will survive? By the way, that was a Democratic senator by the name of Robert Byrd, who authorized the spending of about $1 billion to improve American education. Now let's look at the actual results. How do people deal with history? How well do they know history? I'm sure maybe you've heard people talking about this today. There's a little bit of a controversy about what we teach our children. I mean, again, if you're just waking up and you don't remember the last 20 years, this might be new. But let me just read you a few headlines from the New York Times, for example. Ignorance of history shown in college freshmen. Only 6% of 7,000 students could correctly identify the 13 colonies. Only 15% could choose that McKinley was president during the Spanish-American War, and less than 25% could identify 2 major contributions from a list, not just off the top of their head, from a list. 2 major contributions of Thomas Jefferson. A Pulitzer Prize-winning historian observed that, quote, young people today are all too ignorant of American history. That was 1943. He was talking about the greatest generation. That was Alan Nevins. Another study, students unable to identify basic facts of history. Elementary students, only 16% could achieve a passing score. Only 33% of high school students could achieve a passing score of, quote, the simplest and most obvious facts of American history. Even at the college level, that was only 49%. Of course, this was in 1917 in Texas, when kids just spent all day on the internet and playing video games, right? There is a pattern here. And as a historian, this is something quite peculiar to me, that you can go decade after decade after decade and find examples of this idea that Americans don't know their own history. And it's almost as if the laments, the Jeremiads that these senators, these representatives engage in are like historical echoes, that it's the same story over and over again. Well, what I want to do today is to do a little bit of diagnosis and a little bit of a suggestion of a solution. I want to answer the question, why is it that Americans seem to be so detached from their history, so unable to answer those basic questions? And I think it has a lot to do with that reason why many people would struggle to answer the question, how do I account for the last 20 years? Those tools, those means of thinking, the way that we engage in the methodology of history is not a skill that we cultivate, but it's a skill that you need to cultivate for a very personal, selfish reason. And so that's what I want to talk about today and explore. And the idea is ultimately, if you had to run out right now, the answer is history. Who needs it? Everyone, right? Everyone. Everyone needs history, whether you are if you're going to become an accountant, whether you're going to become a mechanic, whether you're going to do any profession you can imagine. Selfishly, personally, as a human living on earth, who is engaging in a lot of the things that Craig spoke about this morning, That due process, there's a lot there that resonated with me as I was watching Craig give that lecture that integrates with why we all need historical thinking. So let me turn first to these contemporary problems. Today, school boards across the country are debating, governors and legislatures are debating, what should our children learn? Should we enact the 1619 curriculum from the New York Times? Should we simply take what the mainstream media, or at least the leading newspaper as it considers itself, has the Pulitzer Committee deemed to be good American history? Or should we instead enact the 1776 Commission's idea of American history? What should we teach our children? Should we teach them that America is tainted, distorted, sin at its origin? Should we teach them that it's a great nation that's overcome all obstacles? Well, the one question that you might be wondering about as you read the news and as you tangle with the ideas, trying to figure out what exactly critical race theory might be, to figure out what exactly is in the curriculum of our schools, the one question you might ask is, how are we teaching history? Not just the what. Because one of the most important factors here is that history, like any field of human knowledge, is not content divorced from method. But likewise, it's not method divorced from content. The two have to be integrated. You cannot sunder the content of history, the facts, the record of human events, from the proper method for assessing those events, thinking about those events, and coming to conclusions about those events that are relevant for your life and for our society. It would be tantamount to teaching children language by simply giving them words. No grammar, right? You just pick up a foreign dictionary, you just start memorizing words. I know 70,000 Russian words. Oh, you speak Russian? No. I just know 70,000 Russian words. That's about the same as saying, I know all the facts of American history. I can tell you all the names of the presidents. I can tell you all of the dates of the battles. Do you know history? Do you understand it? It would be the same. Without that methodology, you can't, in fact, claim to understand history. There is a very interesting way. One of Ayn Rand's principles in epistemology is that there is a sum but any principle. What history you learn is obviously relevant to you as an individual. It may be relevant to our culture as a culture. But the method of learning history is, in that sense, agnostic about the content that you learn. But it is not agnostic in the sense that you learn content. There has to be a marriage between the two. So where did this all go wrong? Where in the world did Americans who were raised from, let's just be quite clear here, the American founding, the actual founding, right? The period between, say, 1763 and the 1790s. Those Americans in that generation who did not have government schools, by the way, who were often taught at home, who went to private colleges in order to achieve what was considered an education at the time, those Americans deeply understood history. They made references not only to previous British administrations and kings, but they made reference to Greek and Latin and Renaissance Italian thinkers. They were deeply immersed in history, and they deeply understood history in a way that mattered to their lives, to the point that they were willing to risk their lives, their honor, and their sacred fortune for their interpretation of what was right in history. But as America developed through the 19th century, and as America developed its own schooling system, a government-mandated schooling system, where children were required to attend, where curriculums were set down by centralized committees, where legislatures, those in power, got to decide what our children should learn. By the time that all developed, in psychology and in educational theory, behaviorism had taken hold. Edward Thorndike, who was a contemporary of John Dewey, was one of the major influences on American education. And he was essentially a behaviorist. You pour knowledge into the child repeats it back, you've achieved your goal. One of his colleagues had originally done a study noting that there were various ways to think about history from the psychologist's perspective. You could say that children might understand the present events in the light of the past. They might be able to sift through a documentary record in order to achieve a probable cause of what might have happened. They might be able to appreciate, in almost an artistic way, a historical narrative. And they might even be able to use thought questions and historical reflection. And the last of the things that they noted is that children might be able to actually answer factual questions about historical events. And they noted that that was the easiest thing to test. So guess what? Being good behaviorists who had the idea that you simply give inputs and get outputs started developing testing. And that's why many of you may now be dimly recalling or perhaps stuffing down the idea of your history education where it was simply facts and dates and names and memorization. Because in fact, the teaching, the pedagogy of the progressives and of the behaviorists at the early part of the 20th century, which sadly lasted until almost the 1980s, that dominated American education, was one where simply knowing the facts was what history was about. I often have the somewhat embarrassing experience that when I introduce myself, if I'm at a cocktail party or a new event and I'm meeting new people, and they ask what I do, and I say, oh, I'm a historian. I teach history. I usually get one of two responses. I either hear that, oh my gosh, I hated history. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. People, they just have this visceral reaction, and they tell me, you say the word history, and they tell you how much they hated history. And then they realize, oh, I don't want to have insulted you, so they apologize. And I understand. And on behalf of the historical profession, I apologize. Your history teachers have likely done an horrific job of educating you about history. The other response, though, is the one where I hear someone say, oh my gosh, I love history. Oh, history's so great. And then they start telling me about some weird aliens that they saw on the History Channel. And it's like, okay, maybe not. There's a kind of bivalent response. But what that first response tells me often is that people say, but I love those stories. I love the ideas of history, but gosh, my history education was so poor. And as the audience that I might be interacting with, or as the individuals that I might be interacting with, start to get a little bit older, typically I start to find that people want to come back to history. They realize in their own lives that there's something missing. And they realize that poor, almost destitute account of history that is just memorizing the facts and the names. It's not that it doesn't help, right? Having ready access to content like that is certainly helpful in thinking historically. But it's not all that it is. That you memorize it, you take the test, and 2 years later you've forgotten it all because it has no purchase in your mind. The unfortunate thing, the unfortunate reality, which gives rise, I think, to the problem of the last 20 years, or really in this case, the last 40 years, is that by the time educational psychologists, cognitive scientists, had broken away from that behaviorist trap, the idea that we're just machines made of flesh, inputs and outputs, and what's called the cognitive revolution in psychological sciences. When psychologists first started realizing, amazing, 1980, they first started realizing that we are conscious, rational beings with cognition as our main driving force. In history, the problem was, methodologically, the whole game was sold. Postmodernism, post-structuralism had already taken over. By the mid-1980s, two leading postmodernist historians published in a leading historical journal the following observation about history, which may, I think, explain a lot about what we see today. They noted that, quote, within whatever rules historians can articulate, all interpretations are equally valid. It is necessary for historians to shift the grounds for the assessment of integrity from the absolute or objective truth to the moral or political. That is, rather than believe in the absolute truth of what we are writing, we must believe in the moral and political position we are taking with it. They continue by rejecting, quote, the assumption that that if we abandon our claim to objective truth, we must be writing in bad faith, end quote. So basically all bets are off. History, the study of the past, becomes nothing more in that guise than an assertion of power. And that assertion of power through the telling of stories or the reframing of stories or the invention of stories has only become more naked in the last 20 or 40 years. The idea that you can construct a tendentious, falsehood-laden account of all of American history and publish it in the New York Times, win a Pulitzer Prize, and then expect that to be taught in schools doesn't run afoul of this. Because this is just yet another story that is convenient to the moral and political truth that wants to be advanced by those who are advancing that truth. The postmodernists, who have not, thankfully, infected every historian, they are not a insubstantial, but not the dominant group within the historical profession, nevertheless have spread the idea that what we study is not the grand narrative. We no longer try to discover big truths. We no longer try to understand things objectively. Instead, we have microhistories, which are not bad. Some of them are quite good. Studies of very small, chronologically narrow topics that reveal the wonder and the diversity and all of the kind of craziness of history, but that don't help us as human beings to understand the big picture, which is the point of history. As the English writer L.P. Hartley noted, many of you probably know this quotation, the past is like a foreign country. They do things differently there. Right? And the idea is that the wisdom that's contained in that insight is that the past is like a foreign country. It's a different time with different assumptions and different people. And what we do in studying history is we make ourselves a part of that. We study history primarily to understand the past. To give you just a working definition that I came up with many years ago of what history actually is. History is the systematic study of the record of human action with the goal of understanding past events. The key terms there, I'll repeat. History is the systematic study of the record of human action with the goal of understanding past events. It's systematic. It has rules. It has rules of evidence, almost like a courtroom. The great English historian Collingwood once noted that, I think I wrote this quote down, that as natural science finds its proper method, when the scientist in Bacon's metaphor puts nature to the question, so history finds its proper method when the historian puts his authorities in the witness box and by cross-questioning extorts from them the information which in their original statements they have withheld, either because they did not wish to give it or because they did not possess it. For the historian, Collingwood notes, there is no difference between discovering what happened and why it happened. It is a systematic study of the record of human action with the goal of understanding past events. That means taking seriously human nature. Taking seriously that there needs to be an understanding of the past. This is not mere antiquarianism. We do not do this just to say, oh, isn't it funky that they dressed so differently in these, isn't it nice? I mean, and literally lots of museums, there's a value in that. I don't want to diminish that. I don't want to denigrate the idea that antiquarianism, going and seeing the ways that people live, the average lives of most of people in history, probably not great, but interesting. But that's not historical study in the meaningful sense, to get us out of this epistemological crisis that we're in. The way that we get out of that is through a proper application of historical method. And that proper application of historical method means, as the English historian Geoffrey Roberts noted, quote, we should follow a human action approach to the study of history, which emphasizes the freedom of individuals to act, the importance of reconstructing what happened from the actor's point of view, the role of accident, miscalculation, and unintended consequences in shaping historical outcomes, and the idea that people do things for a reason, that their individual and collective actions are the stuff of history, and that it is possible to construct an evidence-based account of why past actors acted as they did is, for most of us, plain common sense. As E.H. Carr noted, history is like reconstructing the cause in a prosaic car accident. If Mr. Jones speeding around a blind corner, strikes Mr. Robinson and kills him in a car accident. We need to understand the causes of that event. Well, to do so, we might investigate why Mr. Jones was driving so fast. We might investigate why the blind corner was not marked in a way that he could take account of. We might ask all kinds of questions. Historians today ask about why industrial civilization produced cars in the first place. They assign Mr. Robinson's death to the fact that he was crossing the street to buy a pack of cigarettes, and therefore the tobacco industry is responsible for his death, right? You can see the difference there in contrast between the causes that are approximate, that are final in Aristotle's words, the things that actually cause the action, versus the ones that are merely sufficient to the action. Sure, Mr. Jones couldn't run down Mr. Robinson before the invention of the automobile. But that doesn't explain what happened that day. We need to be, as historians, like prosecuting attorneys. We need to look at the record of human action and ask the same kinds of cross-examining questions to assess, for example, whether a document represents the facts or represents an opinion about the facts, whether we have the complete record, whether this notion, this idea actually fits the story that we're trying to tell. And just to give an example, the education psychologist Sam Weinberg at Stanford University, who writes a lot about historical thinking and how we can teach it to children, in a recent article, it just happened to be about the Boston Massacre, just up the road. And he traces the history of how that story has been told from the very moment in 1770 on March 5th when it happened, when a bunch of upstart colonials started throwing ice, snowballs, 3-inch thick pieces of wood at these British guards. And a mob started to develop. And the British guards called their captain, and the captain came. And as the chaos was ensuing, as people were pushing and yelling and shouting taunts at each other, suddenly one of the soldiers thought he heard someone yell, "Fire." Fire opened. And 3 individuals lay dead at the scene, 2 more died days later, and the Boston Massacre occurred. But if you read about it in a historical book today, you probably read very famously about a young man named Crispus Attucks, who was depicted in that original lithograph that was made in 1770, that was inscribed with the sort of scene of battle, with the British having these mean looks on their faces, all organized, which is not really true, the colonists falling dramatically. And Crispus Attucks was supposedly the ringleader of this. Many textbooks today call him a hero of the mob. It's a quote from John Adams. What many of these accounts fail to note is that in celebrating the role of Crispus Attucks, the first African-American or possibly Native American, African-American heritage to die in a revolutionary event, is that John Adams actually said that in his summation defending the British soldiers against the charges of murder. Right? Now that's an interesting thing that we have to ask ourselves a question about. Why would John Adams have been defending? Now many people know this, but what did he actually say about these individuals? What did he actually talk about in this case? Well, as it turns out, Adams had defended those soldiers for fear that if they simply were given to mob violence, as was likely to be the case if the authorities had not stepped in, and if they weren't given a fair trial, as was, again, threatening to be the case, he worried that the Patriot cause, which was only in its infancy in 1770, would be squandered by the ill will of those who saw the mob rising to power. The mob, by the way, which in that same summation, John Adams described as a motley rabble of saucy boys, Negroes, mulattoes, Irish teagues, and outlandish jacktars. Adams did not see kindly on this mob. He, in fact, said, "Why should we scruple to call such a set of people a mob? I can't conceive unless the name is too respectable for them." So it's important that we actually do the hard work of historical investigation, that we not hold on to cherished or pet truths about what we wish the past had been like. When we investigate, for example, difficult historical questions related to something like the Civil War, the American Civil War. Was the Civil War, in fact, the abolition of slavery as a part of the Civil War, motivated more by the forces of Christianity or by Enlightenment liberalism? How do we know? Well, I submit we would have to understand an enormous amount, for example, about the character of a person like Abraham Lincoln. We would have to trouble over the various, sometimes contradictory statements that are, in fact, part of his record, and ask ourselves, what is essentially true about Abraham Lincoln? What did he actually believe? We would have to look at his letters, diaries, public speeches, stump speeches in political campaigns. We would have to put together that whole record and not simply cherry pick those things that match the narrative that we had already arrived at. In fact, what we would need to do is we would need to be like a prosecuting attorney, attempting to disprove the case that we hoped would be true, to see whether the facts stacked up to that. And that, I submit, is the first of the two most important ways that history matters for all of your lives. Epistemologically, those skills that the historian brings to the task of understanding remotely past events are the same skills that we need to bring to our own lives today, to understand how it is that our political world came to be the way it is, whether or not we have forgotten the last 20 years. But I think the deeper, and in fact the more personal, and indeed maybe more important reason why everyone needs history is that it's a fundamental way to live our lives morally. Lord Bolingbroke, an inspiration for many of the American patriots, famously noted, "History is philosophy teaching by example." And what that means, in some senses, is that Bolingbroke, in fact, agrees with Ayn Rand that ideas cause history, that they are the prime mover. The ideas that human beings accept and act upon are what drives human events. But in a more important sense, there's an interesting way that this ties into Ayn Rand's unique view of morality, which is something that occurred to me as Craig was speaking this morning. In that due process, in listing all of those facts about human nature, one of the facts at the level of our morality is that human beings, as Craig said, have to act. Life does not sustain itself. And we have to act in a way that is all-encompassing. No matter what you do, from the smallest action to the grandest, spread out over decades, has an impact on your life. It trends either positively or negatively. There are no neutral actions. There are some that have very small impact, de minimis, that are easily reversible. But on one path or another, a life lived according to a certain principle is a life lived in a direction. And one of the other unique facts that Ayn Rand notes about human consciousness is not only do we not come pre-programmed with the values that we need to pursue, or rules in the form of virtues that we need to enact in our lives, but so too we come with a limited consciousness. We cannot hold at one time dozens or hundreds or thousands of examples. We cannot conceptualize all of those things over a lifetime. In order to live a moral life, Ayn Rand tells us, we need to have principles. We need to have principles of action so that when we are engaging in that 5-second rule, as Craig talked about, or as we are engaging in those habits that we know are life-sustaining and flourishing, we have ready access to them. We use our conceptual consciousness in order to condense down a lifetime of information about what moral action means. And I submit that history, as Bolingbroke noted, is the best reservoir of those examples. Whether one needs to contemplate and how to conceptualize and put into principle the idea that integrity matters, or one needs to judge, is it okay to compromise on certain values to achieve a bigger value, right? You could look at the history of industrialists in America, businessmen, businesswomen who have achieved great things. Look at their record of action. Look at how they played on the stage of history. And ask oneself, does this look like the life I want to lead? Is this the kind of morality I want to embrace? That's what history does for us, personally, selfishly. It allows us to see the great inventors, the great businessmen, the great statesmen. Heck, it even allows us to see the failed examples, the people who stumbled on the stage of history, the people who gave up their values, and what that looks like. That's what history does. It is the raw material by which we can enrich our own knowledge of what our moral lives can and could look like going forward. It gives us those epistemological tools to understand the world, but moreover, it gives us a vision of what our lives can be like, regardless, as I said at the beginning, of our chosen profession. It's something that is at the very heart of being human. As Cicero noted, to be ignorant of that which happened before one was born is to always remain a child. So, to conclude, I encourage all of you to take that as a motive for action, to mature into your full adulthood, whether you're whatever age you are, coming into your full human adulthood, coming into full capacity as a moral actor, means bringing that truth into your life and understanding those things that happened before one was born. Thank you. Okay, so the silhouettes can now start lining up and asking questions. Craig was right. It's very difficult to see anyone's faces. Yes, go ahead.
Yes, I would like to get your opinion on something.
Of course.
Does not, and this is trying to marry the epistemological with the psychological, does not the practice of omission inevitably lead to the practice of commission with respect to facts? I mean, if you're going to ignore those facts that do not support what you choose to believe, ultimately you are leading yourself toward a place where you will actually commit falsehoods, not just ignore those that you don't agree with. Comment on that. Thank you.
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting observation. I wasn't sure where you were going with that, but I think that you're absolutely right. If we understand, for example, the nature of a story. I mean, one of the other things that I had a lot of material. I actually was joking with Craig today. I said, I had three hours of material. What do you think? He looked at me. He said, no, you can't do 3 hours of material, Eric. But stories, in the way that we create a narrative about history, leaving certain facts out is, as you say, an act of omission, leads to necessarily an act of commission. I agree with you, because in that sense, imagine you arrive at home and, or not you, but imagine someone arrives at home and this individual's spouse says, where have you been? Right? Simple white lie, I leave out one part of the story. Well, that has implications. I now have to fake that reality going forward. Anytime that the rest of reality would interact with that real part of my narrative, now I have to fake that. Those little errors, those little omissions. For example, if you simply omit certain letters that Abraham Lincoln wrote in private and took merely his public statements, as some historians do, you can make the case that he was a white supremacist. And there are historians who make this case, that he was a statist, he was a white supremacist, he was any kind of slur you want to put on the record of Abraham Lincoln, you can find someone who's done it. I mean, any of the figures of history, but Lincoln just happened to come to mind, because they omit certain truths that are well known in the documentary record. They simply leave those things out. Well, guess what? That doesn't just lead them to tell a false story about Lincoln. It leads them to all kinds of other distortions, because now that story of Lincoln, which is actually integrated with the other facts of Civil War America, doesn't fit anymore. It doesn't actually match the reality of what Seward or any of his other cabinet did. And so now you have to create new fictions. And so it concatenates out to a bigger and bigger lie, so to speak, that cannot be contained. Yeah.
Thank you. So my question is regarding how you fight the fake history, because in Ukraine, for example, what communists and collectivists did, they rewrite the whole history of nations, and Russians doing it for today. For example, how you combat this, fake history and the falsehood of the past, because the past is used in current and in politics and ideology.
Sure. To put it, Ukraine, Russia, in a big historical context, it's bad enough that Americans distort their history in the ways that they do. World historical events, the famine in Ukraine, right? The Soviets didn't acknowledge. Probably Putin and his historians today still don't acknowledge such things. How do you fight that? I think if that's your calling, if that's something that you care about, I think that the most important thing, and I agree with a lot of historians today who would say the same thing, is that you have to work to preserve that historical record, right? You have to publicize it. You have to encourage people to write about it. You have to protect those documents that do exist. There are unknown but incredibly heroic individuals who have preserved the legacy of some of those stories, the documents, as I said, the systematic study of the record of human action. Those records, whether they be diaries, journals, the things that we can use as historians to demonstrate beyond a reasonable doubt in that kind of courthouse of history that such things happened, right? Whether it's the grave sites or whatever. But that is, as you note, an incredibly fraught project. The systems of power and oppression, look at the whole record of the Soviet tyranny and Stalin's crimes, despite what Khrushchev said in 1953 to announce that he was denouncing Stalin and, I'll apologize for like 10% of his crimes. Those things eventually came out, right? When communism fell, or at least seemed to fall, I don't know, maybe not. In 91, when people got access to the archives, when people started decrypting things, when those things became available, that was incredibly validating for many people who knew those stories as the oral tradition. But as someone who wants to fight for that, I would say, protecting those archives, protecting the record of history, because despite its missteps and despite its many theoretical failings, there are still hundreds, if not thousands, of working historians who do care about the truth. They don't understand the bigger issues, but they understand it enough to practice in the right way and to tell those stories. And in this case, it's a lot like the culture of free speech that we have in America. We need to have the right voices out there to combat the bad voices. Yeah.
Thanks, thanks, Eric.
Yeah.
So I have a question about the role of philosophy when you're studying history. Because in one sense, if you have the right philosophy, it can be useful. And you use it to kind of orient yourself maybe. But if you have the wrong philosophy, though, then it can kind of maybe get in the way and it matters. But then also, do you kind of need to, it seems like you need to kind of suspend whatever prior thoughts you might have to kind of be, in order to be more objective about things. So in the one sense, it's kind of useful if it's right, but you also kind of need to give it a break for a little bit to get in touch with facts.
Yeah, it's an interesting balance that needs to be drawn. I think what is essential is enough of a right philosophic perspective when it comes to the question of what sort of creature is man. And that is where a lot of the traction of history comes. The Marxist view of history, which suggests that economic forces determine our ideas, right? Or in the contemporary neo-Marxist or adapted Marxist version, the thoughts that our accidental characteristics of birth determine our ideas. Or worse yet, that we don't even have ideas, that we're all just glandular squirtings going out and contending for power. All of those things, ultimately, as you said, that would be absolutely catastrophic for history. You may not need to have the right idea about what is the best society, for example, the right political ideas. You may not even need to have the right sense of what is the best moral system to adopt. But what is absolutely essential is that you need to have a few key ideas. That human beings have free will, that their actions can be explained by their ideas, even if imperfectly, right? Even if they have rationalizations and other things. That ultimately the movers and shakers of history are moved and shaken by the ideas that they adopt, the big philosophic ideas that guide their action. You don't have to agree with those ideas in order to make sense of them. You do, in a sense, have to suspend disbelief. You have to make sense of, for example, individuals in history motivated by belief in supernatural beings, right? We may reject that philosophically, but we do have to step aside for a moment and imagine. History is a lot about imagination. Imagine what that feels like. What is the texture of a compelling belief in a supernatural deity that has the power to communicate with me and tell me what to do? You need to explain that, in a sense, because that's the philosophic idea that explains that maybe that individual's behavior, right? As opposed to simply saying, well, he's obviously wrong, let's dig down and try to find the real idea. We have to take seriously that people are motivated by bad ideas in history or wrong philosophies. And that does take some a kind of holding in stasis our own judgment about that. We want to bring that judgment back when we make our interpretation. I always like to say that there are 4 whats of history, which actually end up being different questions. But there's the what happened, there's what's the evidence for it, or how do we know? There's the what is the cause, right? The why Why did these things happen? And then what is the significance or our interpretation of this? And that's the stage where we bring our own philosophy back and we can make judgments about history. We don't want to do that when we're assessing the what, because then things will be confusing. It'll be like a different country. It'll be like trying to explain why in other countries people have different customs. Well, they just do, right? Well, other people have different motivations. They just do. So there are these kind of moments when we need to step back and then moments when we need to re-engage. And I think that re-engagement really comes in the interpretive, not even the why phase, not even the explaining the events. That is where you need to believe in free will and ideas causing history. But the why in terms of the judgment really comes in that last what, that last step. Nick.
Hey. So at the end of your talk, you talked about how there's some leaders who are morally great and some who are morally bad and bad examples. My question is, do you think that a proper telling of history kind of requires the morality of objectivism? The reason I ask is because if you have, say, the morality of objectivism and I have, say, the morality of altruism, we may both objectively agree that the 19th century, there's a lot of wealth created and all these businessmen made a lot of fortunes. But you might say that that's a great thing, but I might say, well, they didn't spread the wealth, and therefore they're morally not so good. So do you think it's necessary that you need a morality like objectivism or something like it?
I think that in the widest sense, to account for a historical question, for example, let's pose this in the form of a question which a historian might consider. Was the massive expansion of industrial productivity during the 19th century a benefit to humanity, in the form of a question? And you would say, as an objectivist, my answer would be, yes, absolutely, right? We can show the record of human action that brought thousands, if not millions of people out of poverty. The standards of living went up. The wealth started to spread around the world. The four horsemen of the apocalypse, which used to be humanity's companions throughout history, right? Everyone always, capitalism can be blamed for poverty, capitalism can be blamed for death. Like all of these things that have been around humanity forever. And we can say, no, look, we can show you the record of human action has massively transformed human life in a positive way, if by positive we discern these are the things that count for human life: prosperity, longevity, flourishing. Now, if you say what counts for human life is altruistically serving your fellow man on the command of a deity, then yeah, your conclusion is going to be very different. Your conclusion is going to be, well, it was a great record, right? There was enormous wealth distributed. But it wasn't really until the 20th century when we started having politicians who understood that you needed to distribute all of that and take it away and then give it to others that things got to be better. And there are historians who make this case. So I think in the broadest, most universal sense, in order to have a correct evaluation, that last piece of history, we absolutely do have to have a good philosophy, because otherwise we'll be confused about those moral judgments that we make about the past. And ultimately, as much as many historians, in fact, many of the good historians today, want to eschew any kind of moral judgment. They want to do what the German historian Leopold von Ranke said, is that to tell things as they really were. No judgments, right? To simply document and record and tell the story as authentically as you can. But why? Right? Ultimately, because you need to know what that means for your life, right? You need to know what that means for your society. So if you don't have a proper view of that, those stories are going to have very different import on your life. So in a sense, very good historians can be working outside of the understanding of what is truly important to human life, but not so much so that they have a bad methodology. So that moral difference, I think, ultimately comes in the question of historical judgment. Yeah.
You mentioned that we as a society are struggling to account for the past 20 years. Would you say that this is a more recent problem, or have people throughout any time period struggled to account for their most recent historical events?
That's a very interesting question. I think that there's something to be said. Let me share some personal observations. There's something to be said for the power of historical thinking, that the more that you take history and historical methodology seriously, and the more that you understand philosophy, the better able you will be to assess recent history. the less that you take those methods seriously, the more that you're going to be pulled and kind of lurch from one direction to another. Take for example, a cultural phenomenon today, the transformation of the Republican Party. What accounts for that? If you look at my hypothetical example, 2001, the Republican Party doesn't look a lot like it looks like today. Something changed. What accounts for that? Many people who don't have a good historical sense latch on to the smallest details, the most momentary, I don't want to say trivia, but the most momentary lurches in our political culture, and they don't want to look at the big, long duration. What happened in the last 20 years is unique to the last 20 years, and many of the causes did not become manifest until the last 20 years. But that does not mean that we cannot see in the long duration that many of these things had precedent. Right? One of the problems with a lot of contemporary history that people write is that they latch on to their favorite explanation, which gets them something in the now. Right? It helps them weave that narrative to the now, and then it becomes journalism in a sense. It becomes an interested, biased attempt to push the narrative in one direction. But I think that the better historians, and the more that someone takes history seriously, the better able you are to analyze recent trends. It doesn't make people immune from really, really bad mistakes, but it does a little bit to immunize them at least. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Malcolm Brown. I was on a site called Twitch, if you know what that is.
Sure.
It's a streaming site.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And I was listening to a person complain about America. And they were saying they do all these bad things.
Yeah.
And I said that they did good things too.
Yeah.
And then she said, read a book. And then I said, read the right books.
Yeah. Well, Malcolm, good for you. Yeah.
My question is, even though I said that in the moment,
Sure.
how does one tell what is fact and what is just a flat out lie? Because
Yeah. There's a lot of that out there today. Yeah. Malcolm, I think the really difficult thing today in particular is that, for example, let's take, for example, one of the most controversial things that I started out with about what children are learning today in today's schools, right? Are they learning, as some people like to say, history warts and all, or are they learning a sanitized version of history, or what are they learning? Now, the objective way to approach this problem is to note that, as the first questioner said, omissions, leaving certain parts out of the story can if they're essential, can in many ways lead to commissions, to crafting whole lies out of a story. You can have competing books. There are books that say this, books that say this, and we can bury each other in books with different fancy narratives that don't really match the historical reality. I think the ultimate thing that one can do to overcome this problem is fundamentally to ask oneself, when you're talking about these things, what is it that is essential to the story? So, like a filmmaker, and I say this somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but I think this is a really Alex Epstein, I think, was originally one that told me this. To say that history is by necessity selective, right? It doesn't tell everything that happened, and it never can. But if it does so intentionally, leaving certain facts out because they mar or they twist the interpretation in a different way, that's bad. But when they leave certain things out that are non-essential to the story, for example, and this is Alex once said, I forget what the comparator was, but it's like he said, complaining that, let's just say, I'll make the example. Complaining that milkmaids in Belgium in the 1350s didn't make it into part of the story about how the Black Plague affected Europe is kind of like saying Jack Bauer never takes a bathroom break on 24, and yet it's supposed to be all 24 hours of a day. It's like, no. Like art is a selective recreation of reality, history is a selective recreation of a story about the past that helps us understand and explain those actions. But it does not necessarily tell every action. It has to tell the essential ones. So, for example, the controversy today, if you are to teach the record of American freedom, Well, the history and philosophy of liberty in America. You absolutely cannot do so. That's a slight plug, by the way, everyone. Yeah. You cannot do so without accounting for both the bad and the good in American history. And it's foolish to say that there isn't, right? That there aren't bad and good things in American history. America has not been a shining beacon of unlimited progress from the beginning, as some people would like it to be. I mean, my gosh, I'd like it to be. It'd be great if it had been. Right? I mean, we'd all be in hover cars and I don't know. Imagine the kind of prosperity if America had been on a universal trend toward greatness. There have been a lot of bad things, right? The 20th century, the 19th century, there is a true record of bad things that happen in America. What's important is not acknowledging those bad things, but identifying the philosophy behind them, right? To the extent that the history, the record of America has blemishes, is the extent to which it has betrayed its own essential nature as a freedom-loving society that respects individual rights. That, I think, that is probably the most powerful thing you can do, right? Acknowledging slavery, acknowledging, the rise of communism in the White House during the Roosevelt years, acknowledging all kinds of evils in this world, but acknowledging for the purpose of highlighting the degree to which that is a departure from what is right. That, I think, is the most important thing one can do. Yeah, and again, in the context of the moment, if you're having a conversation, sometimes it's almost as important to step away and say, I'm willing to listen to your argument, but you need to be willing to listen to mine. Like, I'll listen to your factual narrative, and I can point out that, hey, if those things are true, and let's leave that in abeyance for right now. Let's say we're not sure if those things are true, but let's take it for that what it is. We have to ask ourselves, are those the essence or are those the accident? Do we have just maybe one more question, I think? Yeah.
Hello, to
Hi.
piggyback off of Malcolm's question.
Sure.
How do you tell the difference between someone using the uncomfortable or evil facts about history for their own purposes and someone acknowledging them and giving them their rightful place front and center, like as a historian?
Yeah. Let me see. Let's take. Trying to think of a different example, just to kind of give you more concretes. So take, for example, a favorite topic of many historians, going back a couple questions about the development of industrial society. Next question. Many historians like to focus on the fact that labor conditions and labor relations in many parts of the United States were not what we would recognize as being freedom-loving and individual rights respecting. That's not the way they put it. But if you think that various armed gangs, both on the side of producers and workers, were confronting each other over questions about who got to control the shop floor, right? Who got to determine the rules and regulations of labor. And it's a real conflict. It did happen, and many ill acts were committed in the service of that. Right? There are cases where businessmen who are otherwise great businessmen made bad choices. Now the question is, how does one discern whether that's an essential or not? And I think that's the case where you need to be able to think in principle about history. You need to look at the wider record, and you need to ask yourself, just like about a person's character, an event in history or a movement in history needs to be evaluated in the context of the whole event, not just the isolated instance. So you see someone, for example, slam a door in someone's face, but everything else you know about the person tells you that this person is, generally speaking, a good person. Well, you have to integrate those facts. You may have to adjust your evaluation, but you have to take it in the context of the whole thing. So you take industrial development, the productivity of capitalism, and you say, were there moments where historians can actually identify labor conflicts that were violations of individual rights? Absolutely. But if you look at the broad sweep of where humanity was prior and where humanity is after, and you ask that same question, you say, well, it seems really strange that if this massive productivity and enhancement of human life had to have been built on the backs of a derogation of human life, that doesn't fit in principle. And so one needs to ask more questions. Why was this happening at the time? What explains it? You need to go deeper into that context. Just in the way that you would, what explains this individual's action, this individual that I know, this bad action that I witnessed? I'm not going to just isolate that. I'm going to ask the wider questions. What do I know about this person? What might have caused this? What explains this? And not simply go on that first judgment. Okay, Craig says it's time to go. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.